Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we finish off our 3-week series looking at the cardiovascular system by spending our time looking at all of our systemic veins. Remember last week we looked at primarily the systemic arteries, which are responsible for transporting oxygenated blood away from the heart into all of our tissues. Now, ultimately, once we get to our tissues, right, we're in the capillaries, oxygen is going to be given off into the tissue spaces, and carbon dioxide is going to come back into our blood capillaries. That deoxygenated blood then circulates back through the venules into our major veins. So it's today that we're going to take a look at all of the venous structures that passively circulate blood back to the heart. Now, the one rule that always remains true is that arteries deliver blood away from the heart and veins deliver blood back to the heart. Now, when we're looking at systemic circulation, the arteries all contain oxygenated blood, whereas the veins all contain the deoxygenated blood. And remember, deoxygenated doesn't mean that it's void of oxygen. It just has much less oxygen than our oxygenated blood, but also much more carbon dioxide because we've just picked up the carbon dioxide from our tissues. Now, one thing that can help you in learning all of the different names is that a number of them share the same name as the artery because they're named based on the region that they're located. We're going to see that there are some new vessel names that we're going to come across today, but primarily in the upper extremity and the lower extremity, many of the veins share those same names as the arteries. Now, last week we spoke about coronary circulation. And if you recall, it's the coronary sinus that is responsible for collecting all of the deoxygenated blood from coronary circulation and emptying it back into the right atrium. The term sinus is a generalized term for a larger vein that you find throughout the body. So you're going to notice when we look at the veins that drain deoxygenated blood from the brain, that they are all named sinuses. Okay, but the main job is the exact same as all of the other veins throughout the body. So we're going to take a look at the veins of the head and neck. We're going to look at the superficial veins of the upper extremity as well as lower extremity. And then we're also going to take a look at a few of the deeper veins responsible for then draining the deeper structures. So we're going to start off here looking at the head as well as the neck. Now, it's important to remember that the path of flow in the veins is always going to be directed back towards the heart. Last week, when we looked at the arteries, we looked primarily from the left ventricle to the aorta and from the aorta outwards. And so today we might look at some of these vessels in the same orientation, but you need to remember that it's the veins that are going to be draining blood back towards the heart. So as I mentioned, within our cerebral region, draining the blood from the brain, we have a number of sinuses. And you'll see from this perspective that we have two sinuses that run right in the mid-sagittal plane. They are known as the superior sagittal sinus and the inferior sagittal sinus. The inferior sagittal sinus drains into the straight sinus, and then the straight sinus as well as superior sagittal sinus join together to drain into the transverse sinus. Now, something you can appreciate from the lateral perspective, and we'll see this on the next diagram, is that from this bifurcation where you have the straight sinus draining into the superior sagittal sinus, we have two transverse sinuses that are going to move out laterally, ultimately draining into left and right sigmoid sinuses that connect directly to the internal jugular veins. Here we're looking at another inferior perspective of the brain, and you can see here the superior sagittal sinus. This is a cut portion of it. It is going to run on the superior surface of the brain in that mid-sagittal plane. And what I'm wanting to focus on is this point here where the straight sinus feeds into the two transverse sinuses. So at this point here, you see this straight sinus that is coming inferior posteriorly and ultimately draining into the right and left transverse sinuses. Ultimately, both left and right transverse sinuses all drain into the sigmoid sinus. And sigmoid sinus kind of follows this S-shaped sort of pattern right here, right around the cerebellum. And the sigmoid sinuses ultimately drain into the internal jugular vein. Now, last week we had looked at the arteries that were responsible for taking oxygenated blood up towards the head, and those were the common carotid arteries. The jugulars are the veins that run in the exact same orientation Except remember, they are veins, so they are draining blood from the brain. Okay, so the jugular veins run along with the carotid arteries. So here we can see the sigmoid sinus that's ultimately draining into the internal jugular vein. We have an internal and we have an external jugular vein. The internal ultimately is draining all of the blood from inside the brain, and the external is ultimately draining all of the deoxygenated blood from the outside of the cranium. Okay, so similar, last week we looked at the arteries, so the internal carotid and the external carotid. Internal carotid fed the brain with oxygenated blood, and the external carotid fed the outside of the cranium with oxygenated blood. Okay, so the internal and the external jugular veins are draining deoxygenated blood from those same regions. So the internal jugular vein drains from the brain, and the external jugular vein drains from the outside of the cranium. Now, ultimately, the internal jugular vein is going to be draining into the brachiocephalic vein. All right, now, last week we had seen just a brachiocephalic artery on the right-hand side. Well, in the venous system, we have a brachiocephalic on the right and a brachiocephalic on the left, which you can see a small portion of there. And ultimately, it's the brachiocephalics that then drain directly into the superior vena cava, which drains back into the right atrium, and now you're back to the heart. Now, to help you organize the order in which these venous structures drain into one another, I've created these visual flow charts to hopefully help you be able to organize this information for yourself visually. We have the superior sagittal sinus, which runs superiorly in that mid-sagittal plane, anterior to posterior. We have the inferior sagittal, which runs deeper in that mid-sagittal plane, more inferior, in the brain, and then ultimately drains into the straight sinus. The superior sagittal sinus, as well as the straight sinus, both drain into the transverse sinuses. Okay, so remember you have two of these. So now we are splitting into left and right sides. So the transverse sinuses ultimately drain into the sigmoid, which drains into the internal jugular, draining into the brachiocephalic, back to the superior vena cava. And then as we just saw in the previous diagram, the external jugular vein drains further along in this direction here into the right subclavian vein. Okay, we're going to see that the rest of the upper extremity is also going to drain into the right subclavian, but it's important to understand the difference here of the external jugular vein draining into the subclavian versus the internal draining directly into the brachiocephalic. Ultimately, external jugular draining the external aspect of the cranium into the subclavian vein, which then drains into the brachiocephalic, along with the internal jugular back into the brachiocephalic, draining into the superior vena cava, and back into the right atrium. Okay, so that provides you an overview of how the cerebral veins ultimately drain back into the heart. Last week, when we looked at the thoracic aorta as well as the abdominal aorta, we looked at a number of arteries. Now, all of the structures supplied by those arteries are also going to have veins that drain them. Two additional veins that I want to introduce you to this week are the azygous vein and the hemiazygous vein. And if we take a look here, you'll notice that the azygous is going to be running deep within the thoracic cavity as well as the hemiazygous, but they ultimately drain into different structures. As you can see, if we follow both of these inferiorly all the way down to the common iliac vein, they offer a way in which deoxygenated blood from the lower extremities is able to be circulated back in towards the heart. Say there was an issue in circulation through the inferior vena cava, the azygous and hemiazygous vein are capable of dealing with sort of this backdoor approach to allowing for blood to circulate back. And so the main differences here, the azygous ultimately drains into the superior vena cava, and the hemiazygous, you can see here, drains into the brachiocephalic. So now we're going to take a look at the superficial veins of the body responsible for draining the upper extremity as well as the lower extremity. Now, the way we're going to cover these vessels is from the heart and away from the body, but remember, these structures further away are draining into the more proximal structures. So here we have the superior vena cava. Remember I mentioned go into that Superman position and all of the structures above the heart will drain back into the superior vena cava. So the upper extremities are located above the heart, and so therefore they drain directly back into the superior vena cava. From the superior vena cava, and here we're looking at the right side of the body, so we have the right brachiocephalic vein. And you can see here, here's the right internal jugular, and then there is the right external jugular draining into the subclavian. Okay, so from the brachiocephalic vein, subclavian, we have the axillary vein, and now this is where it changes. Whereas before we just moved from the axillary artery into the brachial, into the radial and ulnar, here we have a number of different vessels, both on the medial surface, lateral surface, and then the other midline and running deeper through the upper extremity. So if we continue along from the axillary, this is where we sort of have that split. Here running within the internal compartment of the upper extremity, we have the right brachial vein, and the right brachial vein then connects directly to the right radial and right ulnar veins. And the right radials and ulnars then connect directly to the deep and the superficial palmar venous arches. So ultimately, blood from the palm of the hand is going to be draining back into either the right radials or right ulnar veins. Ultimately, those then are going to drain directly into the right brachial vein, which drains into the axillary, subclavian, brachiocephalic, superior vena cava. Now, the other two veins that drain the lateral aspect of the arm and drain the medial aspect of the arm are the cephalic on the lateral aspect and basilic on the medial aspect. Now, to be able to help you to remember these names a little bit better, I want you to again go into that Superman position. So abduct the arm so that the palm of the hand is out here, right? You're in that horizontal plane in line with the shoulder. In this position, the cephalic vein located on the lateral aspect of the arm is now on top, right? So cephalic refers to the head. So cephalic vein is running on the upper portion of the arm in this position. Whereas the basilic, located on the medial aspect, if you bring the arm up into that abducted position, the basilic runs on the underside of the arm. And so that's where basilic. Okay, so that's a good way to help you to remember the orientation of both of these veins. But ultimately, they are running down the entire lateral for cephalic and medial for basilic lengths of the arms. So ultimately there, from the arches, you have drainage into the radial as well as ulnars, and both of those are ultimately going to drain into the brachial, which connects directly to the axillary vein. Now also, we drain the lateral as well as the medial aspects of the arm through the cephalic on the lateral and basilic on the medial. And those as well converge and drain back into the axillary vein. The axillary vein is then continuous into the subclavian vein, which drains into the brachiocephalic, and then the brachiocephalic empties into the superior vena cava. So now we're going to take a look at the lower extremities. So if you recall, we had previously the abdominal aorta was the major blood vessel running through the abdominal cavity. Here we have the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava is continuous from the right atrium running all the way down through the thoracic cavity as well as abdominal cavity. And the inferior vena cava runs all the way down again until the level of the umbilicus, where it then splits into the common iliac veins. Those common iliac veins then also split into the internal iliac and external iliac, and it's the external iliac that's continuous to form the femoral vein, which runs into the, we can see here, popliteal on the posterior aspect, and then we have the posterior tibial and anterior tibial. And the anterior tibial connects directly to the dorsal venous arches, and the posterior tibial connects to the deep plantar venous arches. Now, two other veins that we have that are new here are the greater saphenous vein, which runs down the entire medial portion of the leg. And we have the small saphenous vein located on the lateral aspect of the lower leg, draining into the popliteal. So we have the greater saphenous on the medial aspect, draining all the way up into the femoral, and we have the small saphenous on the lateral aspect of the lower leg, draining into the popliteal. So everything else here, running straight through, is exactly the same as to how we saw it in the arterial system in terms of names. Remember, because they are the veins, they are draining in the opposite direction. The addition here of the small saphenous, remember it is located on the lateral aspect, draining into the popliteal vein. And the great saphenous or greater saphenous vein drains all the way through the medial aspect of the entire leg into the femoral vein. Okay, so that's why they're named small saphenous, because it really only drains the lower leg into the popliteal, and the greater saphenous runs along the entire medial compartment, draining into the femoral vein. Ultimately, from the femoral, all drains into the external iliac, common iliac, back through the inferior vena cava. So that's an overview of our systemic veins in the body. Remember, the systemic veins are all draining blood back towards the heart, and it's all deoxygenated. Why? Because we gave off the oxygen to the tissues and we took up the carbon dioxide from the tissues to take it back to the heart so that we can ultimately send it out to the lungs through the pulmonary circulatory loop. Now, we've spent a lot of time already referring to pulmonary circulation, so we're just going to go through and connect the dots, looking at the systemic veins, how they drain back towards the heart, and then ultimately to the pulmonary circuit, and then back out to the body. So remember, if the structure is located above the heart, such as the upper extremity or the head and the neck, all of those veins drain back into the superior vena cava, which drains into that right atrium. Any of the structures located below the heart are going to be draining that deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium through the inferior vena cava. And remember, the inferior vena cava runs through the entire thoracic as well as abdominal cavity. Ultimately, all of that deoxygenated blood from systemic circulation drains into the right atrium. Now, there's also going to be blood coming from coronary circulation draining through the coronary sinus, that vessel that opens in the back of the right atrium that's responsible for draining all of the deoxygenated blood from the myocardium back into the right atrium. So now that the right atrium is full of that deoxygenated blood, it will send it through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle contracts and sends that deoxygenated blood out through the pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, and ultimately the left and right pulmonary arteries. Now, those arteries, remember, are deoxygenated in this case because we need to get the oxygen from the lungs. So they're arteries because the blood is flowing away from the heart, but is deoxygenated because, remember, that blood has come from systemic circulation. Remember, those pulmonary arteries then will converge into capillaries, and those capillaries are the sites of gas exchange. So we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen moves into the blood, and the carbon dioxide that's being transferred here is then going to move into our tubes of our lungs to allow us to breathe it out. So now the blood has been oxygenated. So the blood that's been oxygenated now is sent back through the pulmonary veins. Remember, we have two feeding into either side of the left atrium. Left atrium contracts, sends that oxygenated blood through the bicuspid, mitral, or left atrioventricular valve into that left ventricle, and that massive myocardium contracts to send all of that oxygenated blood out of the left ventricle into the aortic valve, into the aorta, and through the rest of systemic circulation. Now, once we get to the respiratory system, we are going to zoom into looking at the lungs to see exactly how the carbon dioxide and oxygen are being able to exchange by the capillaries and the alveoli. Now, recall last week we looked at all of the arteries of the abdominal cavity. This week we haven't really covered any of the veins, but remember, for every artery there has to be a vein which is going to be draining the blood that's deoxygenated back into circulation. But what's unique here about all of those organs within the abdominal cavity is that they are all responsible for draining blood from our digestive organs. And remember, we are going to be absorbing a large amount of substances from the external environment through our digestive organs. And so we need a way to be able to filter and process the blood contained in all of those veins. So ultimately, regardless of whatever vein you're looking at within the abdominal cavity, all of those veins converge and drain into the hepatic portal vein. Okay, this single vein acts as a main shunt or portal to be able to drain all of that blood back into the liver. And the whole purpose there is so that we are able to process and filter that blood. And then once the liver has processed and filtered that blood is then further drained back into the hepatic veins, and the hepatic veins connect to the inferior vena cava. All right, so instead of all of these veins directly draining into the inferior vena cava, we have them drain through the hepatic portal vein to be filtered by the liver to ultimately drain through the hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava and back to the right atrium of the heart. And why do we need to drain all this blood through the liver? Well, we're going to be absorbing a lot of nutrients. In the small intestine, that's the main primary source of nutrient absorption. And so we're going to be absorbing carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and we need to be able to process that. And so the hepatic portal vein allows us to drain that blood that's going to be rich in, say, blood glucose and allow us to maybe store up some of the excess if we don't need it all right away. And this is then when we would store it up as glycogen. And also, there are other harmful products that we may be absorbing, and so we need to be able to then detoxify the blood as well. And so, alcohol is one of those substances that the liver is capable of being able to remove and detoxify for us. Now, we spend a lot of time through biology as well as anatomy. We look in a lot of detail at the whole process of producing gametes, and then ultimately we sort of end the content looking at the fertilized zygote. And then from there, we jump into looking at the developed human. We don't really spend a lot of time looking at embryology or the development of the fetus. And so what I wanted to add in here was this small component looking at the differences in fetal circulation compared to in a neonate, so a newborn. Now think about this. When a fetus is developing, they don't require the use of their lungs like we do. Where do they get their oxygen from? Ultimately, their source of oxygen is from the mother. And the way in which that the fetus obtains that oxygen is through the placenta. And so the mother breathes in oxygen, the oxygen gets into the blood and then travels throughout the body, and ultimately that oxygenated blood ends up at the placenta. Well, oxygen is capable of diffusing into the fetus's blood vessels and then can be transported throughout their body. And then when the fetus produces carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide then is transported back to the placenta so that the mother can then breathe it out. Now, blood itself is not crossing the placental barrier between the maternal side and the fetal side. It's the gases as well as the nutrients that are going to be transported into fetal circulation to be used by the fetus. And so let's think about this. Well, number one, the fetus does not require its pulmonary circuit, right? It's not using its lungs. We still need to circulate blood out and allow for the lungs to be able to develop, because as soon as the fetus is born, the fetus will start to breathe on its own. But while in utero, fetal circulation does not require the pulmonary circuit to oxygenate the blood. And so there are two bypass vessels located within fetal circulation that we don't see in neonatal circulation or even adult circulation. And those are the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus. Now, the ductus arteriosus here, let's take a look at our blood vessels. We're coming off of the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. Now, remember, we mentioned the lungs aren't in function here to be able to provide oxygen to the fetus, so we don't need as much blood going here. We need to get it back to the placenta. And so the ductus arteriosus connects the pulmonary trunk. And so the ductus arteriosus connects the pulmonary arteries directly to the aorta. And so the blood, instead of moving to the lungs, back through the left side, out through the aorta, the blood can simply bypass and move directly into the aorta to be circulated back to the placenta. Now, we've looked at a structure known as the fossa ovale, and the fossa ovale is a remnant of the foramen ovale that exists within us when we are developing as a fetus. The foramen, remember, foramen refers to an opening or a hole. Foramen ovale is a hole that connects the right and the left atrium to one another. And so the foramen ovale now allows for any blood that's coming back to the right atrium to not have to even pass through the ventricle pass through the ductus arteriosus. Instead, the foramen ovale allows for another bypass to be able to skip pulmonary circulation and send blood from the right atrium directly to the left atrium through the left ventricle and out through the aorta. Right, so both the ductus arteriosus as well as the foramen ovale are acting as bypasses of the respiratory system. Now, similarly to the respiratory system, the fetus is not requiring the use of the liver in terms of filtration. Because remember, what is doing the filtering? Well, it's the mother's liver that's going to be filtering her blood before it ends up circulating to the placenta. And so ultimately, the mother's liver is doing the filtering, and so the immature liver of the fetus does not need to have all that blood flow through hepatic portal circulation. And so we have this other bypass known as the ductus venosus. And the ductus venosus bypasses the immature liver to allow for that blood that's coming from the placenta to ultimately flow through the heart and be passed out to the rest of the body. And so these three bypasses are really important because they exist within fetal circulation. Once the fetus has been born, these vessels close up and are no longer required because the liver must now do the filtration and they're breathing on their own. And so the lungs must receive the deoxygenated blood and oxygenate it, and there must be a separation of the right and left side of the heart. Now, one of the main reasons that these two vessels, specifically the arteriosus and ovale, close off is that the increase in pressure within the thoracic and even that being passed on to the abdominal cavity that occurs when the baby takes its first breath and starts breathing on its own, as we see as crying, that increase in pressure causes these structures to close off. And as a result, the circulatory system then develops as we see it in a mature adult. Now, we have a number of different pulse points that we can check on an individual. Specifically, dorsalis pedis, posterior tibial are very effective ways in being able to check pulses, specifically on patients that may be in a hospital bed lying on their back, but might have an IV of sorts that might be attached here into their hand. And so you don't want to necessarily be grabbing their wrist to try to find their radial pulse. Similarly, the carotid pulse, it's a really good one to check on ourselves because it's so prominent. But on a patient, you're not necessarily going to be wanting to take your fingers into their neck. It's more invasive. And so through the popliteals, but mainly the dorsalis pedis and posterior tibial pulses, these are ones that you would most likely use within a clinical setting. Okay, why could we feel a pulse this far away from the heart? And that's because of that tunica media. Remember, as the left ventricle contracts, the tunica media throughout our arteries contracts along with it to be able to propel blood through that single contraction of the cardiac cycle. And so ultimately, you're able to take blood pressure distally away from the heart, and it gives you a similar pressure to what you can expect to see here within the left ventricle. Now remember, our pulse rate, that is the rate of cardiac cycles in a minute. So the average optimal number is your 72 beats per minute, but our range is from 60 to 100. And so anything below 60 is known as bradycardia. It's slow. Brady means slow. And tachycardia, tachy means fast, would be a heart rate above 100. Now remember, this is resting heart rate, because if you're exercising, you would expect to see your heart rate go well beyond 100. And the way we typically check blood pressure is using a sphygmomanometer, and we want to occlude the brachial artery. And so typically the cuff will be wrapped around the bicep, and the flat portion of the stethoscope, the diaphragm, is typically then slid underneath the blood pressure cuff. The cuff is then inflated to completely occlude the brachial artery. And what we do then is that we slowly release that pressure. And as we do, we'll eventually hear some sort of sound, which is known as a corticough sound. And the first time you hear that sound indicates the systolic pressure. Now, you then slowly release all of that. Now, you then slowly release that pressure from the cuff further until the corticough sounds disappear. And at that point, you've now reached the diastolic pressure, right? The pressure under relaxation. And so by taking those two numbers, it gives you your blood pressure reading for that individual. And so normally you're looking for anything under 120/80. You obviously don't want your blood pressure to be too low because you're not going to be getting enough blood circulating, especially if you're standing up into your brain. But lower blood pressure is definitely normal for a lot of people. You want to make sure, though, that your blood pressure is not too high. And in biology, we're going to be able to spend some time looking at the cardiovascular system, specifically cardiovascular diseases, and how they can predispose you to higher blood pressure. So that brings us to the end of our look at the cardiovascular system. So we've looked at the heart, and we've looked at how the heart connects then to the arteries and the veins, and how we are capable of circulating oxygenated blood out to the tissues, and then draining all of that deoxygenated blood back to the heart, sending it out through pulmonary circulation to the lungs, picking up oxygen, and then sending that back to the heart to be sent out to the rest of the body. And so in the second half of this week's lecture, we're going to move into looking at the lymphatic system. And the reason that we cover the lymphatic system with the cardiovascular system is that they work in a similar fashion, where you have a number of vessels scattered throughout the body with the main purpose of circulating fluid throughout the body. Now, the lymphatic system is set up similarly to the cardiovascular system. And that, as you can see in this diagram, you have a number of lymphatic vessels that are spread throughout the body. And their main function is to be able to circulate the fluid from the body and bring it back into circulation with the cardiovascular system. Now, the fluid that is being circulated throughout the lymphatic system is known as lymph. And ultimately, lymph from our extremities, as well as deeper structures here of the body and our head and neck, is all going to be draining back through two main ducts into our subclavian veins. And it's important to understand that this lymph that I'm talking about is a fluid that is similar in composition to our blood plasma and our interstitial fluid. And it's important to understand that this lymph is the same fluid that we saw in our blood vessels that we referred to as plasma. And it's the same fluid that we saw in the interstitial spaces known as interstitial fluid. Right? So fluid circulates throughout our body and it moves from the blood vessels, where it's known as plasma, into our tissues, where it's known as interstitial fluid. And excess then is taken up by these lymphatic capillaries into lymphatic vessels that all drain back into the subclavian vein and bringing fluid back into the cardiovascular system again. Now, the lymphatic vessels are the most numerous of structures located throughout the body. We also have lymphatic nodules as well as lymph nodes. And lymph nodes, as you can probably palpate when you get sick, are the places where our immune cells hang out, waiting for any foreign pathogens that are trying to infect us. Now, there's also a number of organs scattered throughout the body that are part of the lymphatic system, and they are the thymus, the spleen, as well as our bone marrow. Now, as I mentioned, the whole main purpose of the lymphatic system is to maintain homeostasis, so balance, of our body fluids. And we do that by allowing for the exchange of fluids within these different compartments. And so we've just been looking at the cardiovascular system, and so this should look similar to you, where we have the arteries that then have the off-ramps known as arterioles, and those arterioles then feed into the capillary beds. And it's the capillaries where you have oxygen being given off and carbon dioxide coming back in. Now, what else did we say is capable of moving through these very thin capillaries? Water and other dissolved substances. And so you have the fluid, which is plasma, from the blood. It's capable of moving from our blood vessels into the interstitial spaces, right? Into the tissue space. And what is it known as once it's there? Interstitial fluid. Now, you know of interstitial fluid whenever you've, say, sprained an ankle and it's swollen, okay? Anytime you have any accumulation of fluid within your tissues, you'll see it as swelling, which we call edema. Now, some of that excess fluid is capable of moving back into our blood capillaries to then be circulated back through our veins to the heart. Any excess that's not taken up by our blood capillaries is capable of moving into lymphatic capillaries. And so once that interstitial fluid moves into the lymphatic capillary, it is now known as lymph. So we're just looking at fluids ultimately in different compartments of the body. So in our cardiovascular system, we call the fluid plasma. In our tissue spaces, we call it interstitial fluid. And then once it's taken back up into our lymphatic capillaries, we call it lymph. Now, lymph is formed from the interstitial fluid. So excess interstitial fluid is going to move into these lymphatic capillaries. Now, something unique about these lymphatic capillaries, in comparing them to blood vessels, is that they are very porous. And you'll notice that the adjacent simple squamous epithelial cells that make up the walls of the lymphatic capillaries, they overlap one another. And because of that poor fit, they create these openings, which allow for the fluid from the interstitial space to then circulate into our lymphatic capillary. And once it moves into the lymphatic capillary, we now call it lymph. Now, something that's unique about these pores is that fluid can only move in one direction. Once it's taken up into the lymphatic capillary, it stays in the lymphatic capillary. Whereas with our blood capillaries, fluid can move in and out of the blood capillaries. Now, something else that's unique about our lymphatic capillaries compared to our blood capillaries is that our lymphatic capillaries are blind-ended. They aren't continuous with any other structures. The only way fluid can move in is through the lateral openings between the adjacent simple squamous epithelial cells. Whereas with our blood capillaries, they are continuous. They have an arterial end and they have a venual end. So fluid flows in one direction through the blood capillaries, continuous from the arteries to the veins. All right, whereas with our lymphatic capillaries, they're blind-ended. And so the only way that fluid can move into the capillaries is through these pores. Now, this is a schematic to give you a perspective on what it is that I've been talking about here with the fluid cycle, how we maintain fluid homeostasis in our body. So ultimately, we have our blood capillaries are identified here by this horizontal vessel. Our arterial side is at one end, and our venual side is at the other. Remember, the arterioles are branching off of the arteries, and arteries have high pressure. And so you're going to have relatively higher pressure in the arterial end of your capillaries than you will at the venual end of your capillaries. And so because of this higher pressure inside of the blood capillary, that's going to force water to want to move out into the tissue space. This is what is going to create that interstitial fluid. Now, at the other end of our capillary bed, we have slightly lower pressure. And so some of that water might be able to move back into our cardiovascular system and then circulate back through the venules. Now, there's going to be interstitial fluid that still exists, and any excess that occurs within the interstitium is going to then move into the lymphatic capillaries through those one-way pore openings and then circulate into the larger lymphatic vessels, ultimately to be sent back to the subclavian veins. Now, I want you to understand when looking at this diagram, we are looking at both lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels. Both of them are illustrated in this one image. This is our boundary from where the capillary ends and then the lymphatic vessel begins. Now, within the lymphatic system, remember, lymph can only circulate in one direction. It moves into the capillaries through those pores, and then ultimately is going to flow back towards the heart, ultimately to the subclavian veins. The capillaries have those pores to allow for fluid to move into the lymphatic capillary, but they do not contain any valves. It's not until you move into the larger lymphatic vessels that you see the presence of one-way valves. And so this is where lymphatic vessels are comparable to the veins of our cardiovascular system. These veins allow for one-way directional flow, but remember, similar to the venous system, it is passive flow. And so we're going to be relying on our muscles to be able to contract and squeeze these vessels to only propel this lymph back to the subclavian veins. So some ways in which lymphatic vessels are similar to our veins: they have three layers. They have a tunica externa, tunica media, and tunica intima. The tunica intima contains the valves similar to veins. They increase in diameter the closer we get to the heart, similar to the veins. Your popliteal vein is going to be much smaller in diameter compared to, say, your inferior vena cava. Well, similarly, lymphatic vessels in the extremities are going to be much smaller in diameter compared to the major vessels, the right lymphatic duct as well as the thoracic duct, that ultimately drain lymph back to the subclavian veins. And again, also flow of the lymph is going to be slow and passive, and it's going to be driven primarily by those muscle pumps, the skeletal muscle pump as well as the respiratory pump. And ultimately, all of the lymph throughout the entire body, all of these lymphatic vessels that you can see illustrated in this diagram, they all drain back into two main lymphatic ducts. They are the right lymphatic duct, which you can see here and illustrated here, and also the main thoracic duct. As you can see in this image here, illustrated by the dark blue region, the right lymphatic duct is responsible for draining lymph from the upper right quadrant of the body. And so any structures located in the upper right quadrant would ultimately be drained back through the right lymphatic duct into the right subclavian vein. The thoracic duct, however, drains about 3/4 of the body, so all structures below the umbilicus, and then the left upper quadrant of the body. And the thoracic duct ultimately drains all of that lymph from 3/4 of the body back into the left subclavian vein. All right, so the right lymphatic duct drains into the right subclavian vein, and the thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. And here's a close-up image here where you can see where they both drain back in to the subclavians. You have here the right lymphatic duct draining into the right subclavian, and you have the thoracic duct ultimately draining into the left subclavian, right where the internal jugular drains into the brachiocephalic. Now, the thoracic duct has a main collecting reservoir known as the cisterna chyli. And the cisterna chyli is responsible for receiving lymph from the left lumbar and intestinal trunks, ultimately collecting that and draining it back through the thoracic duct. One thing to add with this flow chart is that we've talked about lymphatic vessels, and it's important to note that the lymphatic vessels from a given region are all going to collect as trunks. Now, depending on the location of the lymphatic trunk, it's going to flow through either the right lymphatic duct or the thoracic duct. So if the trunk is located in that upper right quadrant of the body, it will flow into the right lymphatic duct. Trunks located in all other regions are going to be flowing through the thoracic duct. The cisterna chyli, as we mentioned previously, is that starting point of the thoracic duct, which you can see extending here up through the thoracic vertebrae. And the cisterna chyli receives fat that we have digested through our small intestine. Now, we're going to be taking a look at this in more detail later on in anatomy when we learn about the small intestine and how we absorb nutrients. Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids, they're all absorbed into our bloodstream, and that circulates back through the hepatic portal vein. Fat is absorbed in a different manner. Fat is absorbed through our lymphatic capillaries and ultimately drains back to the cisterna chyli. And as mentioned, all of the 3/4 of the body will be draining through the thoracic duct. Well, the cisterna chyli then is that reservoir that's the most common drainage trunk for most of the body's lymph. Now, any disruptions to this flow of lymphatic fluid can cause then fluid to accumulate within the interstitial spaces. So if you have any sort of disruption there to lymphatic drainage, that's going to then cause more interstitial fluid to stay within your tissues. And ultimately what that leads to is what we know as edema. So edema is swelling. And what you're seeing here in this image is an individual with pitting edema. So here we're looking at their right lower extremity, and you can see here by depressing the tissue and releasing the finger, they are able to grade the severity of pitting edema by the size of the depression as well as how long it takes for the skin itself to rebound. And so the more fluid in the tissues, the more severe the pitting edema. Now, a number of reasons why we could have fluid buildup. If we have increased hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries, so if you have higher blood pressure in the capillaries, that's going to force more water into the interstitial spaces. If your kidneys are not functioning properly and you're keeping more fluid in your body, in your bloodstream, that's also going to have an impact on increasing your capillary blood pressure, which will increase the amount of water that then will move into your interstitial fluid. Valve failures, whether it be venous valve failures and you have more blood pooling in the lower extremities, that's going to increase the pressure on the venule side and thereby increase the amount of interstitial fluid. If you've been bedridden for a prolonged period of time, you aren't having skeletal muscle contractions to be able to help to move the blood back to the heart, and even your lymphatic vessels circulating lymph back to the heart. A lack of skeletal muscle contractions, for example, if you've been bedridden for a prolonged period of time, will prevent the movement of blood back to the heart. And so if you have more blood pooling in, say, your lower extremities, that's going to cause higher pressure on the venule side of your blood capillaries, which will increase the amount of water that stays in your interstitial spaces. Also, a lack of skeletal muscle contractions is going to limit how much lymph is capable of being circulated back into your cardiovascular system as well, which is going to limit how much interstitial fluid can move into your lymphatic capillaries. And then lastly, for a number of reasons, you can have blocked lymphatic vessels, whether it be due to inflammation, an infection, bacterial, as well as parasitic infections can all cause severe lymphedema. Now, moving from looking at the capillaries as well as the vessels that make up our lymphatic system, we have primary lymphatic organs that are responsible for producing the main cells that we see circulating throughout our lymphatic system. And this is where the lymphatic system is usually combined with learning about the immune system, because it's our immune cells, specifically our lymphocytes, that circulate and hang out in our spleen as well as our lymph nodes, waiting for foreign pathogens so that they can destroy them. So the red bone marrow, as well as the thymus, in addition to the lymph nodes, those are all primary organs of the lymphatic system. The red bone marrow is the site of blood cell production, right? We learned about that, hematopoiesis. And not only red blood cells, but also white blood cells. Our lymphocytes are one of our types of white blood cells that are produced. Now, there are immature lymphocytes that are produced by our bone marrow. The immature B cells are going to stay in the bone marrow and mature in the bone marrow. Okay, so you can associate B for B cell with bone marrow for the site of maturation. And then our T cells, well, they migrate to the thymus, and the T cells are going to mature in the thymus. Now, what does this mean to mature? Well, remember, our immune cells are going to act as our main defense. And so our immune cells need to be able to recognize what is a cell that is supposed to be in your body versus what is a cell that is not supposed to be in your body. Okay, what is foreign? Okay, what is normal versus which is abnormal? And so this process of maturation allows for these immature cells to be exposed to your own antigens, your own markers on your cells that identify your cells as self. That way, when they migrate out to your lymph nodes and the spleen, they're able to recognize your own cells versus foreign pathogens. So the B cells mature in the bone marrow and the T cells mature in the thymus. Now, our lymph nodes provide a housing structure through which all of these B and T cells are capable of residing and waiting for any foreign pathogens to be circulating throughout the lymphatic fluid through these structures. This is why whenever you're sick and your body is fighting an infection, you usually have swelling of your lymph nodes because there is an active immune response going on within these structures. The lymph nodes are set up with an external capsule, and within the lymph node, we have an abundance of reticular fibers which aid in filtration. So you tend to see a lot of reticular fibers within the tissues of these immune system organs, right? Because we're wanting to filter that blood. Also within the lymph node, we have the B and T cells waiting for the pathogens as they circulate through our lymphatic system so that if a pathogen is within our body trying to attack us, the B and T cells can attack it as it slowly moves through the lymph node. Now you'll notice here we have two different types of lymphatic vessels, and these terms we've used in the nervous system. We have afferent vessels and we have efferent or efferent lymphatic vessels. So the afferent, the lymph is arriving at the lymph node, and the efferent vessels are where lymph is going to exit the lymph node. Now, you can't identify this as easily in this image, but you can see this here. We have many more afferent vessels than we do efferent vessels. And the reason that we do is because we want to slow the flow of fluid as we're circulating this fluid back to the heart. Because remember, we don't want any of these pathogens back in circulation. We want to be able to inactivate them by either our B or our T cells within the lymph nodes. And so we slow down the flow to give ourselves the opportunity to be able to fight those pathogens. And so you'll always see that a lymph node has many afferent vessels and fewer efferent vessels to allow us to slow the flow of lymph as it passes through the lymphatic system. Lymph nodes are clustered into specific regions of the body, specifically those that have some sort of connection with the external environment. So those regions are the ears, mouth, lungs, your genital region, digestive tract, as well as the mammary glands. We also have the presence of secondary organs, primarily the spleen, and then lymphatic nodules. The spleen is the single largest mass of lymphatic tissue that exists within our body. And the spleen is responsible for not only recycling our old red blood cells, but there are a high abundance of B and T lymphocytes that exist within the spleen to be able to act as the main filter of our blood. If we were to take a frontal section of the spleen and look inside, you would see that there is red pulp and then white pulp, which actually looks more purple in this image here. Now, the red pulp contains a number of specific cells. It has macrophages, red blood cells, and platelets. And this is where the old red blood cells are going to be broken down. And what do we need to break them down for? Well, they live for about 120 days. And then once they die, we need to recycle those components, specifically the iron that is contained within the heme groups that make up our hemoglobin proteins. And so the red pulp is responsible for the breakdown of those old red blood cells as they circulate into the spleen, and then the blood flows out of the spleen. Now, the white pulp is responsible for the immune defense. The white pulp contains the lymphocytes, B and T cells, as well as some other phagocytic cells, those that are going to be engulfing foreign pathogens. Those are macrophages as well as dendritic cells. And we're going to cover those in much more detail in the immune system in biology. One other thing that the white pulp is responsible for is the production of red blood cells in the fetus. Remember, the fetus is not fully ossified. And so the development of the red bone marrow within the skeletal system is not fully complete. And so initially, the white pulp of the spleen is responsible for producing the red blood cells that the fetus needs to be able to transport oxygen throughout its body. Now, once the skeletal system is fully developed and the red bone marrow is capable of hematopoiesis, the red bone marrow is then responsible for taking over the production of red blood cells in adults. Okay, so primarily in adults, the spleen is going to be working to break down old red blood cells and recycling its parts, and also in filtering our blood from foreign pathogens. And then lastly, lymphatic nodules are other secondary organs. Now, main difference between a lymph node and a lymphatic nodule is the presence of a capsule in the lymph nodes. Lymphatic nodules do not have a capsule. Okay, so they are simply lymphatic tissue without the capsule. And some examples of lymphatic nodules in our body are our tonsils. Within the ileum, the terminal portion of our small intestine, we have essentially tonsils in the intestines that are known as Peyer's patches. And then lastly, two different names, MALT and GALT are the two abbreviations you may see. MALT refers to mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and then GALT is a specific type of MALT. So GALT is gut-associated lymphatic tissue. So you specifically see GALT within your digestive system. And the whole purpose of these lymphatic nodules is to provide us with immune support. Okay, so whether that's here in the oral cavity or further along our GI tract through the Peyer's patches, as well as the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And that brings us to the end of our lecture for this week. So we're going to spend much more time looking at the lymphatic system, specifically how the immune cells function to provide us with protection once we get to the end of our biology course this semester. For now, if you have any questions, please reach out, send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in tutorial. Take care.